Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. When the sun set, early nightfall in the ancient world. As you listen, imagine standing in a world without switches, screens, or glowing numbers on a clock. The sun is lowering itself toward the horizon, and with it, the day is quietly ending. In the ancient world, this moment carried weight. Night did not arrive gradually or politely. It came with finality. Once the sun disappeared, life slowed, narrowed, and often stopped altogether. In ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the setting of the sun marked a clear boundary. There was no illusion that the day might continue indefinitely. You felt night approaching long before it arrived. Shadows lengthened. Colors drained from stone and earth. The air cooled. Animals altered their sounds. People adjusted their behavior accordingly, because ignoring nightfall was not an option, it was a risk. In cities, if they can be called cities by modern standards, streets were narrow and uneven. After sunset, they became difficult to navigate. There were no streetlights in the modern sense. Oil lamps existed, but they were precious, smoky, and expensive to maintain. Most people did not carry them casually. Light was not something you wasted on wandering. In ancient Rome, wealthier households used oil lamps made of clay or bronze, fueled by olive oil. Even then, they were used sparingly. A single lamp might illuminate a small corner of a room, leaving the rest in shadow. The idea of lighting an entire home at night would have been considered extravagant, even irresponsible. For most people, darkness meant retreat. In rural areas, the transition was even more pronounced. Farmers rose with the sun and ended their labor shortly after it set. Fields were dangerous at night. Tools were easily lost. Paths were invisible. Predators, both animal and human, were more likely to move unseen. When darkness arrived, people gathered indoors, secured doors, tended fires, and stayed close. Night in this world was not empty time. It was compressed time. People did not stretch it with distractions. Instead, they folded into it. Meals were eaten earlier. Conversation slowed. Tasks were chosen carefully. Repairing tools, mending clothing, or quietly preparing food for the next day were common activities, but only while light allowed. In ancient Egypt, the sun god Ra was believed to travel through the underworld each night, battling chaos before rising again. This belief reflected lived experience. Night was understood as a time when order weakened. It was not necessarily evil, but it was unstable. You did not challenge it casually. Sleep itself was different. People did not fall into bed exhausted at midnight after artificial stimulation. They went to rest when the body naturally signaled it was time. The absence of light regulated hormones without anyone knowing their names. Melatonin rose. Muscles relaxed. Eyes grew heavy. This was not a wellness strategy, it was simply how life worked. Homes were designed around this rhythm. In Greece, many houses were built inward-facing, with central courtyards. These spaces caught daylight during the day but became quiet, enclosed places at night. Bedrooms were small. There was no expectation that sleep would be long or uninterrupted. It was simply part of the night's structure. Outside, the world grew quiet in ways modern listeners rarely experience. No engines, no electrical hum, no distant traffic. Instead, wind moved through trees. Insects filled the dark with soft, repetitive sound. Occasionally, a dog barked. Somewhere, someone coughed. These sounds were familiar, not alarming. Silence was not absolute, but it was deep. Security at night relied more on routine than force. City gates were closed. Fires were banked low. Families slept together, not for comfort alone, but for warmth and safety. In Roman insulae apartment buildings, night fires were a constant fear. A single overturned lamp could destroy entire blocks. Darkness was safer than flame. You would have known instinctively when it was time to stop. There was no sense of missing out. Night did not offer endless options. It offered rest, waiting, and quiet continuity. The next day was expected, but not guaranteed. Morning was something you prepared for by surviving the night properly. As the hours passed, people slept, woke briefly, listened, adjusted blankets, and slept again. Night was not rushed. It was endured gently, and in that endurance there was a kind of comfort, one shaped by limitation rather than abundance. But how did people understand the long stretch of darkness between sunset and sunrise, when there were no clocks to measure it precisely? And what happened during those hours when sleep did not come all at once? When you wake in the middle of the night today, you instinctively reach for a clock. Even without seeing it, you have a sense of where you are in the night, how long you have slept, how long remains. In the ancient world, this certainty did not exist. Night was not a precise block of hours. It was a living span of darkness, felt rather than measured. Ancient people understood night through changes, not numbers, the cooling of the air, the shifting position of stars, the quieting and then reawakening of animals. Time was sensed through the body and the environment, not imposed by a device. This made the night feel longer but also more flexible. In many ancient societies, night was divided loosely into watches. In Mesopotamia, scribes referred to early night, middle night, and late night. These divisions were practical, not exact. They helped guards know when to change shifts and priests know when to perform rituals. But for ordinary people, these labels mattered less than the feeling of passing time. In ancient Greece, night was often described poetically rather than mechanically. Homer spoke of the time when stars wheel mid-sky, a phrase that conveyed position and duration without numbers. You did not need to know the hour. You needed to know whether night was young, deep, or thinning toward dawn. Romans later developed more formal divisions, especially in cities. Night was split into 4 watches, roughly 3 hours each, though the actual length changed with the seasons. Winter nights were long. Summer nights were short. Time bent with daylight. No one expected consistency. Water clocks or clepsydry existed, but they were imperfect and rarely used in homes. They required constant attention and could freeze or evaporate. Sundials were useless at night. For most people, night simply unfolded. Sleep followed this uncertainty. Contrary to modern assumptions, people did not expect to sleep straight through until morning. Historical records suggest a pattern known today as segmented or biphasic sleep. You went to bed not long after sunset, slept for several hours, then woke naturally. This waking period was not considered insomnia. It was normal. People lay quietly, prayed, reflected, spoke softly with family members, or performed small tasks. In medieval texts echoing much older traditions, this period was called the watch or first waking. Ancient Romans used the term concubia noct for deep night, when most people slept most heavily. Before and after this, waking was expected. You might adjust bedding, add wood to the fire, or simply lie awake listening to the quiet world. For some, this waking time was productive. Farmers planned the next day. Women spun thread by firelight. Men checked animals or tools. Others used the time for intimacy or prayer. It was a private interval, not filled with stimulation but with stillness. Because light was scarce, these activities were limited. The fire provided warmth and faint illumination, but too much flame risked disaster. Shadows loomed large on walls. Everything moved slowly. There was no pressure to optimize the night. It was not a failure to be awake. It was simply part of the rhythm. Outside the home, night belonged to a smaller group. Watchmen patrolled city streets, carrying staffs or lanterns. Their job was not to prevent all crime, an impossible task, but to notice danger early. Fire was the greatest threat. A watchman's cry warning of flames mattered more than catching thieves. In Rome, night watchmen were organized into cohorts. They listened for unusual sounds, breaking wood, shouting, the roar of uncontrolled fire. Their presence was reassuring, even if limited. You slept knowing someone else was awake. In rural areas, this role fell to the household itself. Dogs were valuable night companions. Their hearing and alertness filled the gap left by human sleep. A sudden bark carried meaning. It could signal an animal, a stranger, or simply a passing disturbance. Families learned to interpret these sounds without panic. The sky itself acted as a clock. Constellations rose and fell. Certain stars marked seasonal change. The Pleiades, Orion, and Sirius all carried timing significance. You did not need to name them scientifically to know what they meant. Their positions told you whether dawn was far or near. Moonlight changed the character of night entirely. A full moon turned darkness silver and usable. Travel was easier. Work could extend slightly. A moonless night, by contrast, was thick and absolute. Ancient calendars tracked lunar cycles closely because they shaped human behavior so directly. Night was also when memory and belief became active. Dreams were taken seriously. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, dreams were recorded and interpreted as messages from gods. You did not dismiss a vivid dream as random. It might require action. This gave night an inner life modern nights often lack. When external activity slowed, thought became more noticeable. Silence invited reflection. Without constant noise, the mind wandered but not endlessly. Fatigue returned you to sleep. There was comfort in this predictability. Night always arrived. It always passed. You did not fight it. You moved with it. Even fear was contained by familiarity. Darkness was known, not exotic. Yet night was not equal for everyone. Status mattered. Wealthy households had more light, more space, and greater security. Poorer families slept closer together, sometimes sharing beds with multiple people. Privacy was limited, but warmth and safety increased. In crowded Roman apartments, noise traveled easily. Coughing, murmured speech, footsteps above or below all blended into a constant low awareness of others. You were rarely alone with your thoughts. Night reinforced community, even unintentionally. As the hours deepened, sleep returned. Not abruptly, but gently. The body reclaimed rest when it was ready. No alarms interrupted this process. Dawn announced itself gradually, cool air shifting, birds beginning their calls, light creeping into familiar shapes. Night, then, was not a blank interruption between days. It was a structured, meaningful span with its own customs and expectations. People understood it not as wasted time, but as necessary time. But how did these nightly rhythms shape the emotional lives of ancient people? And what quiet forms of comfort did they find in darkness that modern life rarely allows? As the night moved toward its deepest point, ancient people were at their most unguarded. The tools of the day were set aside. Social roles softened. What remained was the simple act of enduring darkness together. This was where night revealed its quieter comforts, ones that did not depend on convenience, but on acceptance. You would have slept surrounded by others. In most ancient societies, sleeping alone was rare and often undesirable. Children slept beside parents. Siblings shared bedding. Servants rested near their masters. This closeness was practical. Heat was precious, but it also shaped emotional life. Night reinforced belonging. Beds themselves were simple. In ancient Egypt, wealth determined comfort. Elites slept on wooden frames with woven mats and headrests, while ordinary people rested on piles of reeds or cloth. In Rome, mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers were used, but even the best beds were firm by modern standards. Softness was not expected. Blankets were heavy, often made of wool. Their weight provided warmth and pressure, anchoring the body. Sleep was physical, grounded. There were no separate sleep garments beyond simple tunics. You slept as you lived, without transformation. The act of preparing for night was ritualized. Fires were banked carefully, doors were barred, animals were settled. These tasks signaled safety. Once completed, there was little else to do. This closure was psychological as much as practical. The day was finished. Ancient texts reveal an awareness of vulnerability at night. Roman writers advised moderation in evening eating and drinking, believing excess invited restless sleep and bad dreams. Greek physicians linked nighttime habits to health, recommending routine and restraint. Even without scientific language, people understood the body needed gentleness at night. Comfort also came from repetition. Each night followed the same pattern. The predictability reduced anxiety. You knew where you would lie. You knew who would be nearby. You knew the sounds you would hear. This familiarity made darkness less threatening. Religious practices often intensified at night. Evening prayers marked the transition. In Judaism, the Shema was recited before sleep. In Egypt, protective spells were spoken to guard against unseen dangers. These practices acknowledged fear without amplifying it. They gave shape to uncertainty. Dreams, too, were part of night's comfort and risk. A good dream could reassure. A troubling one might prompt a small ritual the next day, but dreams were not dismissed. They were woven into life, not separated from it. When dawn finally approached, it did so without alarm. Light returned gradually. Birds signaled change. You woke because your body was ready or because someone else stirred. The night released you slowly. Looking back, the ancient night offered something modern life rarely does: permission to stop. Darkness enforced limits. It demanded rest. It created shared stillness. Comfort came not from control, but from surrender. Today, night is often filled with artificial brightness, solitary scrolling, and pressure to optimize rest rather than receive it. Ancient nights, though harder and less safe in many ways, carried a collective softness modern life has largely lost. As we move from ancient worlds into medieval ones, the question shifts. When nights grew longer, colder, and more regulated by institutions, did they become more fearful or more quietly comforting? Story 2. The long silence of medieval evenings. As you move forward in time from the ancient world into the medieval centuries, night does not disappear, it deepens. The sun still sets, but now it sets over colder landscapes, heavier clothing, and lives shaped even more tightly by routine and obligation. Medieval evenings were not lively conclusions to the day. They were long, quiet descents into stillness. You would have felt evening arrive first in your body, muscles stiff from labor, fingers numb in colder months. The workday was dictated almost entirely by light. When the sun dipped low enough to blur detail, tools were put away not because the task was finished, but because it could no longer be done safely. In medieval Europe, most people lived in rural villages. Farming dominated life. Fields, animals, and weather determined everything. Once evening came, there was no possibility of extending productivity. Darkness meant danger. A misstep could break an ankle. A wrong cut could mean infection. So work ended early, especially in winter. Inside the home, the shift was immediate. Medieval houses were dark even during the day. Windows were small, often unglazed, covered with cloth, parchment, or shutters. When the sun set, interiors became dim spaces lit only by fire and occasionally a single candle. Candles were expensive. Tallow candles smoked and smelled. Beeswax candles were reserved for churches and the wealthy. Most families relied on the hearth. The fire was the center of evening life. It provided warmth, light, and a sense of safety. You would have gathered close to it not out of sentiment but necessity. The edges of the room faded quickly into shadow. Furniture was sparse. Benches, stools, maybe a table. There was no separate space for relaxation. Evening happened wherever the fire was. Meals were simple and early. Bread, pottage, vegetables. Meat was rare for peasants and saved for special days. Eating late was discouraged not only because of digestion, but because it wasted precious light. Dishes were cleaned quickly. Water was fetched before full dark if possible. Conversation filled some of the silence. Stories were told, often repeated. These were not dramatic performances. They were familiar accounts, local events, family histories, saints' lives. Repetition mattered. It reinforced memory and identity. Children learned by listening. There were no books in most homes. Oral transmission filled the long evenings. Skills, warnings, and expectations were passed quietly, without instruction manuals or schedules. As darkness thickened, activity narrowed further. Spinning wool was common. Women worked fiber by firelight, fingers moving by touch as much as sight. This work was slow and meditative. It could continue after sunset because mistakes were not dangerous. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, or simply rested. Physical exhaustion limited ambition. The medieval day was long, but it ended decisively. Outside, the village grew silent. Roads emptied. Travel at night was rare and risky. Bandits, animals, and uneven paths made movement dangerous. Inns closed early. City gates were shut. In towns, curfews existed. Bells signaled when fires should be extinguished and streets cleared. This was partly for safety. Fires spread easily, but also for control. Night was when order weakened. Churches played a central role in structuring evenings. Vespers marked the transition from day to night. Even if you did not attend, you heard the bells. They reminded you that the day was complete and that behavior should shift. Religion filled the silence left by inactivity. Prayer was a way to occupy time without light. It required no tools. It soothed anxiety. Even those who were not deeply devout participated out of habit. Sleep came early but not instantly. Beds were shared. Mattresses were sacks of straw or chaff. Privacy was minimal. Night clothing was the same as day clothing, perhaps loosened. Medieval people did not romanticize evening. It was not leisure. It was recovery. The body slowed because it had to. The mind followed. The silence of medieval evenings was not empty. It was dense with presence, people, animals, fire, breath. Noise was not constant, but it was meaningful. A creak of wood, a cough, wind against the wall. This silence shaped temperament. Without constant input, thought settled. Worry existed, but it was contained. There was no endless distraction to feed it. Yet night also brought fear. Darkness hid threats. Disease, death, and poverty were never far away. Evening prayers acknowledged this. Comfort and anxiety coexisted. As you lie listening to this world, you might notice something unfamiliar. Permission to stop striving. Medieval evenings enforced rest through limitation, not choice. But as nights grew longer and winters harsher, how did medieval people endure the extended darkness, and what rhythms emerged to carry them through weeks of early sunsets? As autumn turned toward winter, medieval evenings expanded. The sun retreated earlier each day, and darkness claimed more of life's usable hours. In Northern Europe especially, this shift was dramatic. Daylight narrowed to a brief window, and night pressed in from both ends. For weeks at a time, it felt as though the world existed mostly in shadow. You would have noticed the change not on a calendar but in your habits. Work began later because light arrived slowly. It ended earlier because light failed quickly. The productive day shrank, but the night did not feel empty. It felt heavy, something to be managed. Winter evenings were colder, quieter, and more inward. The hearth became even more central. Firewood was stacked carefully and rationed. Running out of fuel was dangerous, not inconvenient. Fires were kept low but steady, enough to warm bodies without consuming reserves too quickly. Homes were often smoky. Chimneys were crude or non-existent. Smoke drifted through rooms and escaped where it could. Eyes watered. Lungs adapted. This was an accepted discomfort, part of surviving winter nights. Clothing stayed on. Layers were worn even indoors. Wool cloaks doubled as blankets. Sleeping meant staying dressed, sometimes even wearing hats to conserve heat. The idea of changing into nightwear would have seemed wasteful. Evenings stretched, but activity did not expand to fill them. Instead, time slowed. People learned to endure stillness. You might sit quietly for long periods, listening to the fire or the wind. This was not boredom as we understand it, it was patience. Artificial light remained limited. Candles were used only when necessary. A single flame might be shared by several people. Shadows dominated the room. Faces appeared and disappeared in the flicker. This shifting light shaped memory and mood. Details were soft. Harshness faded. This environment encouraged introspection. Without visual stimulation, thought turned inward. Medieval writings often reflect this inwardness, concern with sin, salvation, duty, and endurance. Long nights gave these ideas room to grow. Sleep patterns adjusted. Like their ancient predecessors, medieval people practiced segmented sleep. You went to bed early, slept for several hours, then woke during the deep night. This waking period was longer in winter, sometimes lasting an hour or more. During this time, people prayed, reflected, or spoke quietly. Some visited neighbors briefly, especially in small villages where trust was high. Others simply lay awake, letting thoughts come and go. There was no expectation that sleep should be continuous. Medical texts of the period advised using this waking time gently. Sudden exertion was discouraged. Calm activity was considered healthy. Night was for maintenance, not ambition. Churches reinforced this rhythm. Monastic communities divided the night with prayers. Bells rang for matins in the deepest darkness. Even villagers heard these bells faintly, reminders that others were awake, keeping watch in a spiritual sense. This shared structure made the long night feel less isolating. You were not alone in your wakefulness. Somewhere nearby, someone else was also awake, praying, listening, enduring. Fear existed, but it was managed through routine. Wolves, illness, and hunger were real threats, but repetition dulled panic. Each night survived increased confidence that the next could be as well. Storytelling took on a special role in winter evenings. Tales grew longer and more detailed. They filled time and reinforced values. Many were moral stories, but others were simply familiar narratives retold for comfort. Animals were brought closer. In some homes, livestock shared space with humans, especially in winter. Their body heat mattered. Their presence added sound and movement to the night. The smell was strong, but it was the smell of survival. Silence, when it came, was deep. Snow absorbed sound. Wind replaced it. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal. Inside, life contracted to breath, warmth, and waiting. These long evenings reshaped relationships. Conflict had fewer places to hide. People depended on each other. Cooperation was not optional. Night reinforced this dependence. Modern life often treats long evenings as something to be filled or escaped. Medieval life accepted them. They were endured, not conquered. But endurance alone was not enough. Over time, medieval societies developed subtle emotional and social strategies to survive the psychological weight of so much darkness. What quiet comforts, habits, and shared understandings helped people remain steady through the longest nights of the year? By the deepest part of winter, medieval evenings were no longer a novelty. They were a condition of life. Darkness arrived early and stayed long, and people adapted not by resisting it, but by reshaping their expectations. Comfort became less about pleasure and more about steadiness. You would have learned to take reassurance from small, reliable things: the familiar creak of the house settling in the cold, the steady breathing of those nearby, the fire responding predictably when fed a small piece of wood. These signals mattered. They confirmed that life was continuing as it should. Routine became a form of emotional shelter. Evening followed the same sequence every night. Work stopped, animals were secured, food was eaten, prayers were spoken, and rest began. This order provided structure when the outside world offered little variation. Religion deepened this structure. The medieval church framed night as both dangerous and meaningful. Darkness was associated with temptation and uncertainty, but also with reflection and humility. Evening prayers acknowledged fear while offering protection. Candles placed near religious images served dual purposes. They provided light and reassurance. A small flame near a saint's image suggested watchfulness, presence. It was not meant to banish darkness, only to soften it. Communal living amplified comfort. Solitude was rare. Even when awake at night, you were surrounded by others. This closeness reduced fear. Illness, grief, and worry were shared experiences, not private burdens. Music existed, but quietly. Simple songs or chants might be sung in the evening, often religious. Music did not aim to energize, it soothed. Its repetition mirrored the night itself. Touch was another source of comfort. Shared bedding meant constant physical awareness of others. Warmth passed between bodies. Movement was noticed. This contact grounded people in the present. Medieval medical thought recognized the importance of emotional balance. Excessive fear or sadness was believed to weaken the body. Evening routines aimed to calm the mind before sleep. Arguments were discouraged. Loud behavior was frowned upon. Dreams were taken seriously. A troubling dream might prompt confession or prayer. A peaceful one offered reassurance. Night was seen as a space where the soul was more exposed, requiring care. As winter slowly turned toward spring, evenings shortened. Light returned almost unnoticed at first. A few extra minutes each day. Work extended slightly. Spirits lifted. These changes were subtle but deeply felt. Medieval people were acutely aware of light because they lived without its abundance. They noticed its return with gratitude rather than impatience. Looking back, medieval evenings reveal a form of comfort modern life rarely cultivates. Comfort rooted in acceptance, repetition, and shared endurance. Darkness was not an enemy to defeat, but a condition to live within. Today, silence often feels uncomfortable. We fill it reflexively. Medieval evenings suggest another way, one where quiet becomes familiar, even supportive. As we move into the next chapter of night's history, we turn to those who remained awake while others slept, the watchmen, guards, and quiet observers who shaped nighttime safety and order. What did it mean to be responsible for the sleeping world? Story 3. Sleeping with one eye open, night watchers and city guards. Imagine walking through the streets of a medieval town after sunset. You are moving carefully, your footsteps muted against the uneven cobblestones. The moon is hidden behind clouds, and the only light comes from scattered fires and the occasional tallow candle flickering through a window. At this hour, most people have retreated indoors. The streets are silent except for the occasional barking dog or the creak of a cart left in a yard. But you are not alone. A figure moves deliberately through the darkness, a lantern swaying in one hand, a wooden staff or metal rod in the other. This is a night watchman, one of the few people responsible for the safety of the sleeping town. While you sleep, he walks, listening, watching, ensuring that flames do not spread, that thieves do not strike, and that animals do not wander free. Night watchmen were an essential part of urban life, though their status was often low. They were paid modestly, sometimes by the town, sometimes by local guilds or wealthy households, but the responsibility they carried was immense. Without them, city gates could remain unguarded, fires could rage unchecked, and attacks could go unnoticed. In a typical European town of the 14th century, watchmen divided the night into shifts or watches. These divisions were not precise hours like modern clocks. A watch might last until a bell rang, or until the moon reached a certain position. The time was marked by experience, not numbers. A watchman's training came from practice, noticing subtle changes in the environment, recognizing the sounds of danger, and understanding the behaviors of people and animals in the dark. The tools of the trade were simple but carefully chosen. A lantern provided limited light, enough to illuminate a small radius but not so bright as to reveal the watchman's position too clearly. A staff or club was carried for defense. Some towns allowed small bells or horns to signal emergencies. Rope or other improvised tools might be used to block gates or restrain trespassers. Nothing was extravagant. Survival and utility guided every choice. The dangers of the night were many. Fires were the most feared. Medieval towns were dense and flammable. A single overturned lamp could destroy an entire block. Watchmen patrolled rooftops and streets alike, listening for shouts or crackling wood. Even the wind could carry warning or mislead. Then there were human threats. Burglars, pickpockets, and occasional brigands took advantage of darkness. The watchman's role was not always to confront directly. Often, vigilance, shouting, and signaling others was enough to prevent crime. Reputation mattered. If a watchman was known to act decisively, troublemakers avoided the area. Animals also played a role in the nocturnal rhythm of towns. Dogs were invaluable allies, alerting to intruders or unusual sounds. Horses in stables required care, feeding, and occasional checks to ensure they were not sick or frightened. Even domestic cats were monitored, though more for mischief than danger. The life of a night watchman was solitary but socially intertwined. People inside their homes were aware of his presence. They might open a window to give a warning or shout for assistance. He was part of a living network, a moving note of order in the sleeping town. Sleep for a watchman was fragmented. Those who lived within city walls might rest during the day or take short naps before their shift. Alertness was paramount. A single missed sound could have consequences. Over time, watchmen developed acute hearing, the ability to interpret shadow and shape, and a patience born of long, silent hours. For townspeople, the watchman's presence offered comfort and security. Yet there was also unease. Darkness could never be fully controlled. Fires could flare up too quickly. Bandits could act where no one was watching. Every night contained a quiet tension, a delicate balance between vigilance and vulnerability. Some watchmen were volunteers or appointed citizens rather than professionals. Their understanding of the streets came from years of experience, knowledge passed from older generations. They memorized alleys, hidden paths, and dangerous spots. Even the smallest detail, a loose stone, a squeaky door, could signal an anomaly. Unlike modern security, there were no alarms, no cameras, no radios. Every sound and sight was interpreted on the spot. Every decision was made with imperfect information. Night demanded judgment, intuition, and endurance. Yet despite the dangers, there was also a strange rhythm to the work. Hours of stillness were punctuated by bursts of action. The quiet allowed reflection, observation, and attunement to the environment. Night watching was not only about safety. It was a unique form of immersion in the unseen world, a slow, measured communion with the sleeping city. By the deepest part of the night, the watchman had walked familiar streets multiple times. He knew which doors were locked, which chimneys emitted smoke, which dogs were awake. Each step was a quiet assertion that the town could survive the darkness. And still, the night was long. One final patrol would come before dawn, but until then, vigilance continued, almost ritualistically. For a medieval watchman, night was both adversary and companion. Darkness was a challenge to endure, to interpret, and to survive, but it was also a space of mastery, where knowledge of people, animals, and environment made the difference between safety and disaster. But what happened when night watchers failed or were absent entirely? And how did ordinary citizens cope with darkness in times when protection could not be guaranteed? Even the most experienced night watchman could not control everything. Darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was a variable, unpredictable force that reshaped every street, alley, and home. Mist rolled through narrow lanes, masking shapes. Snow muffled footsteps. A wind-driven fire could erupt in an instant. A guard who had walked these paths for decades still found himself uncertain at times. Medieval towns were densely packed. Streets twisted and doubled back on themselves. Doors often opened directly onto public ways. Upper floors overhung lower ones, casting permanent shadows. In such conditions, even a single lapse in attention could have consequences. Records of urban fires illustrate the stakes. In 1212, the town of Hamburg experienced a fire that spread rapidly through wooden homes, igniting in the dead of night. Witness accounts describe residents waking to flames they had no means to combat quickly. Night watchmen, few in number and poorly equipped, could do little more than raise the alarm. The fire consumed homes, livelihoods, and occasionally lives. Crime followed a similar pattern. Burglars and thieves understood the limitations of human vigilance. They exploited quiet hours, moving with careful attention to where guards were absent or distracted. Theft was rarely violent. It relied on stealth, the soft opening of doors or shutters. Yet the consequences for victims could be severe. Food, tools, or money lost at night could jeopardize survival. Even when watchmen were present, enforcement was imperfect. A single bell or shout could deter some troublemakers, but it could not prevent all. Citizens learned to supplement public safety with private measures. Dogs became companions and early warning systems. Families placed objects near doors that would clatter if moved. Fires were banked strategically to illuminate certain areas, casting shadows in predictable ways. The social contract of night watching was fragile. Some watchmen were diligent, others neglected duties for warmth, fatigue, or drink. Town councils frequently complained about ineffective patrols. In some cases, watchmen were replaced or fined for negligence, but enforcement itself was inconsistent. Darkness could never be fully disciplined. Ordinary people also adapted psychologically. Fear was acknowledged, but it was managed. You learned which alleys to avoid. You timed travel for the brief periods when light from the moon or fires was sufficient. You slept lightly if you lived in a riskier area, waking easily at unusual sounds. This was not paranoia, it was routine. The night was an environment with rules, and survival required attention to them. Night was also a time for hidden economies. Some craftsmen worked after sunset, using small lamps or hidden spaces. Informal trade, quiet repairs, or clandestine meetings occurred during hours when the town seemed empty. These activities depended on the watchman's limitations. Their absence in certain spaces created opportunity. The life of a night watchman was thus both solitary and intimately connected to the town's survival. Every failure, every slip, carried potential consequences beyond the individual. Families could lose homes, livelihoods could vanish, and communities could be destabilized by a single unobserved incident. Yet even amid this tension, there was a rhythm. Guards walked predictable routes. Townsfolk observed patterns. Safety was negotiated, moment by moment, step by step. Over time, practices emerged to strengthen night vigilance. In some towns, multiple watchmen patrolled together, especially near high-risk areas like granaries, markets, or gates. In others, signals, bells, horns, and even small fires marked key points of observation. The community shared responsibility. Every citizen, whether awake or asleep, was part of an intricate system. But vigilance alone could not eliminate fear. Nights were long, and the mind, even when tired, remained active. People imagined dangers unseen, overinterpreted sounds, or rehearsed potential threats. This mental alertness was adaptive. It kept families ready, watchmen attentive, and communities cautious. Through these struggles, medieval towns developed resilience. Night became a teacher. It forced people to recognize limits, plan contingencies, and cultivate patience. Darkness was not merely to be survived. It was to be understood, interpreted, and respected. And yet, despite all preparation, disaster was always possible. A fire could erupt. A thief could succeed. Wolves could attack livestock. Illness could strike silently, unnoticed until dawn. Every night contained uncertainty, a tension between vigilance and helplessness. The watchman's work illustrates a profound truth about human life. Much of survival is the quiet negotiation with forces you cannot fully control. Night exemplified this daily, pressing people to observe, prepare, and endure. But what about the intimate, smaller rhythms of ordinary lives under this watchful darkness? How did families and communities navigate nights when danger, discomfort and stillness coexisted. By the deepest hours of night, the streets of a medieval town had settled into a kind of tense stillness. Fires glowed faintly in the windows, lanterns swayed along the main thoroughfares, and the occasional clatter of a dog's paw against cobblestones punctuated the quiet. The watchman continued his slow, deliberate patrol, fully aware that every step was both protection and measurement of the town's vulnerability. Inside homes, life had contracted to the most essential elements: warmth, light, and quiet companionship. Families huddled near the hearth, sharing blankets and breath. Fires were maintained carefully, not too high to risk sparks, not too low to let the cold seep in. The night was largely one of endurance, punctuated by the occasional task: tending an animal, mending a garment, or fetching water. Every movement was deliberate. Every sound was observed. Children, if they slept at all, were never far from adults. Separation at night was a luxury reserved for wealthier households. The closeness of bodies provided warmth and security, and the subtle rhythm of breathing created a shared awareness of survival. This intimacy was practical, but it also shaped emotional life. Trust and interdependence were reinforced nightly in ways modern life rarely requires. Meanwhile, the watchman moved through the darkness like a shadow, himself alert, patient, and alone. His vigilance allowed the town to rest, but it came at a cost. Sleep was fragmented. Fatigue was constant. He learned to rest while half awake, to interpret subtle sounds while maintaining awareness, to recognize danger before it fully materialized. His life was a blend of monotony and crisis, a microcosm of the night itself. Even with the presence of watchmen, the night held risks. Fires could still ignite and spread before they were noticed. Intruders could act in moments when the patrol passed elsewhere. Illness could strike silently. Yet the combination of human vigilance, shared routines, and learned experience reduced uncertainty. Night was dangerous, but it was also predictable. For ordinary citizens, the watchman's presence created a psychological buffer. Even if he was out of sight, people knew he was walking the streets, listening and ready to respond. This indirect guardianship allowed families to focus on their immediate survival, keeping warm, maintaining light, and sustaining quiet activity rather than being consumed by fear. Small practices emerged to cope with darkness and the dangers it contained. Noise became purposeful. Dogs were trained to bark at strangers. Objects were placed to indicate movement or disturbance. Fires were maintained not just for heat, but to cast shadows that allowed observation. Even the positioning of beds and sleeping areas reflected security considerations. Night in this context was a teacher. It instilled attentiveness, patience, and foresight. People learned to read the cues of the environment: the shifting wind, the creak of a roof, the distant call of an animal. Every sound and movement carried potential significance. Mistakes were costly. Attentiveness could save life and property. Yet there was also comfort in repetition. Night followed a predictable rhythm. Even when danger loomed, there was structure. The watchman walked his route, families gathered near the hearth, animals were checked and settled. Darkness demanded attention, but it rewarded preparedness. By the first light of dawn, the town exhaled collectively. The watchman's final patrol coincided with early risers, farmers, bakers, and traders emerging to reclaim the day. Firelight faded, shadows receded, and life resumed its more active rhythm. Night had passed, survived by vigilance and patience. Modern life has largely removed the necessity of such close negotiation with darkness. Yet looking back, we can see that these nightly rhythms, watching, enduring, and sharing the small certainties of firelight and breath, shaped not only survival, but a quiet form of communal resilience. In a world without artificial light or alarms, night was not merely endured. It was inhabited deeply and consciously by those who understood its perils and comforts alike. The balance between vigilance and rest, between fear and shared reassurance, reveals a kind of human adaptability that modern conveniences have largely rendered invisible. Night watchers and sleeping families alike mastered a delicate dance with darkness, a dance that demanded patience, skill, and a calm acceptance of uncertainty. And in that mastery, there is a lesson that echoes forward. Even the longest and darkest nights, if approached with care and attentiveness, can be survived, and in surviving, communities, families, and individuals discover a subtle, enduring strength. Story 4. Fire, Smoke, and Shadows. Life before artificial light. Step into a world where the night is more than a mere backdrop, it is absolute. Imagine leaving a medieval village at dusk and walking into darkness with only a handful of flickering flames to guide your way. The night is thick and tangible. Every movement requires caution. Every sound is amplified. And yet, even in such conditions, life continues, shaped entirely by the limited, uneven light of fire. Before the invention and widespread use of electric lighting, humans depended almost entirely on flame to illuminate the world after sunset. Fires, lamps, and candles were the only tools available, each with its own limitations and dangers. Their warmth and glow were essential, but they came with cost, effort, and risk. In homes, the hearth was the central source of light. Its fire illuminated the room unevenly, casting dancing shadows across walls and ceilings. The flickering glow brought comfort, but it demanded attention. Wood or other fuel had to be added regularly. A fire that burned too low provided insufficient warmth or light. A fire that burned too high could ignite a home. Even a simple meal required careful tending. People adapted to this light in ways modern observers rarely consider. Activities were concentrated close to the fire. Tasks requiring precision spinning, sewing, cutting food were performed where flame could reach. The periphery of the room remained dark, a place where nothing could be done safely. This shaped the rhythms of domestic life. You moved slowly, deliberately, and only when necessary. In wealthier households, small oil lamps or candles supplemented the hearth. These sources offered portable illumination but were expensive. Olive oil lamps in the Mediterranean burned cleanly, but even these were used sparingly. Tallow candles were common elsewhere, cheap but smoky and odorous. Light was a resource, rationed carefully. To waste it was to risk discomfort or danger. Public spaces were even darker. Streets were dim at best, often completely unlit. Towns relied on human activity to maintain visibility: watchmen, torches, or fires in central squares. Beyond these occasional points of illumination, the night swallowed everything. Travelers on country roads had only the moon and stars to guide them. Any misstep could be catastrophic. The unevenness of firelight created a world of shadows. Objects appeared distorted. Walls seemed to breathe. Even the most familiar environment became strange after dark. People learned to interpret movement cautiously, distinguishing between a passing animal, the flicker of flame, or a human figure. Mistakes could cause panic or worse. Despite these dangers, life continued. People used fire not only for practical purposes but also for social and emotional ones. Gathered around the hearth, families shared stories, meals, and quiet conversation. The shadows created intimacy, focusing attention on those nearest the flame. There was a rhythm to evenings, dictated by the rise and fall of light and heat. Smoke accompanied all flame. In small dwellings, it drifted through thatched roofs, poorly ventilated chimneys, and open windows. Smoke irritated eyes and lungs, but it was a sign of life. To have smoke meant warmth, cooking, and activity. Absence could indicate death, illness, or neglect. You grew accustomed to it, interpreting its color and scent as signals of normalcy or trouble. Even in grander structures, light remained limited. Castles, monasteries, and halls relied on braziers, torches, and candles. Tasks were scheduled around light. Writing, illumination of manuscripts, or detailed craftsmanship could not proceed without it. Mistakes were common. Scribes strained their eyes over dim lamps. Artisans adjusted their work for flickering flame. The human eye adapted. Night vision developed slowly, sharpened over years of reliance on weak light. Peripheral perception became vital. Movements were detected before details. Shadows carried information. Sound became a critical guide. In this environment, senses were trained to notice what modern humans often ignore. Even sleep was shaped by flame. Small lamps near beds or hearths offered reassurance. Families slept near light sources, not for vanity but for safety. Fires provided warmth and protection against predators, wild or domestic. The glow became a psychological anchor in the otherwise opaque night. Fire, smoke, and shadows defined not just movement and work, but thought itself. They shaped the way people experienced time, interacted with others, and interpreted the world. Darkness was not simply a lack. It was a canvas upon which human activity, caution, and ingenuity were painted. And yet this world of flame was fragile. A sudden gust could extinguish a lamp. A stray spark could burn a home. Life after dark required constant awareness and careful management. Comfort existed only in balance with danger. So, how did ordinary people manage the tension between the necessity of light and the ever-present risks it carried? And in what ways did these flickering flames shape the rhythms of human life long before electricity erased the night's boundaries? As night deepened in pre-modern societies, life unfolded within the shifting patterns of firelight. The glow of a hearth, a torch, or a small lamp dictated movement, work, and social interaction. Darkness outside the reach of these flames was complete, even oppressive. People learned to navigate it carefully, relying on memory, sound, and the subtle cues of shadows. Hearths remained the center of domestic life, not only for warmth and cooking but for perception itself. Within its radius, details became visible: the threads of a garment, the contours of a pot, the face of a family member. Outside that circle, reality was indeterminate. Shapes and sounds blended into ambiguity, forcing caution. Walking across a room required a practiced awareness of floorboards, rugs, and furniture outlines. Missteps could cause injury, spill food, or extinguish a precious flame. Tallow candles and oil lamps supplemented hearths but brought their own complications. Flames were unstable, flickering with drafts or sudden movements. Shadows danced along walls, stretching and shrinking unpredictably. Objects appeared closer or farther away than they were. Mistaking a harmless shadow for a threat could provoke panic. Conversely, failure to notice danger hidden in darkness could be fatal. In towns, streets were only slightly more forgiving. Torches, braziers, or lamps near gates provided brief points of illumination, but the spaces between them remained pitch black. Travelers relied on moonlight when available. Familiar routes reduced risk, but missteps were common. A misjudged cobblestone could lead to injury. An unseen hole or uneven surface could trap a wheel or leg. The smoke from fires was ubiquitous. In cramped homes, it obscured vision, irritated eyes, and filled lungs, but it also signaled life. Absence of smoke might indicate neglect or calamity. Its texture and movement could help people gauge wind patterns, temperature shifts, or even subtle changes in fire behavior. Ancient and medieval households became adept at reading these visual and olfactory cues, treating smoke almost like a second language. Noise became another critical guide. Footsteps, the creak of beams, the distant bark of dogs, or the drip of water informed movement. People learned to interpret these sounds with precision. Sleep was light for many, broken by unusual noises signaling danger. A stray animal, a stranger, or a shifting object. In this way, sound replaced the light that was always in short supply. Even domestic routines were organized around flame. Meals were timed so cooking could be completed before light ran out. Craftwork, spinning, weaving, sewing was done in the glow of the hearth. Larger projects like repairing tools or constructing furniture were postponed until daylight. Night dictated productivity. You could do only what your limited light allowed. Social life contracted but did not vanish. Families gathered near fires to converse, tell stories, and pass on knowledge. Children learned household skills through observation and repetition under the glow of flames. In some towns, Neighbors briefly met in common areas illuminated by braziers, sharing news or small favors. These interactions were shaped by light. Proximity determined who could participate and for how long. Religious practice also adapted to the constraints of flame. Candles illuminated sacred images, icons, and manuscripts. Evening prayers or meditation were conducted with minimal illumination, emphasizing focus and contemplation. Shadows became part of the spiritual experience, reinforcing the sense of mystery, reverence, and caution. Night journeys were particularly perilous. Travelers relied on moonlight when available, torches when possible. Roads were unpaved, full of obstacles, and often shared with livestock or errant carts. Being caught without light could lead to injury, getting lost, or worse. Guides, if employed, were trained to navigate in darkness. In towns, nighttime curfews, gates, and watchmen provided structure, but even they could not prevent all hazards. Sleep itself was shaped by the limitations of light. Many households kept small flames burning near sleeping areas. Fires were banked to last through the night. The glow offered reassurance against intruders, pests, and the cold. Beds were arranged to maximize proximity to warmth. The senses became attuned to shadows, sounds, and smells, creating a subtle vigilance even during rest. The interplay of flame, shadow, and smoke created a world of constant adaptation. People became perceptive, deliberate, and patient. They moved slowly, watched attentively, and adjusted to the environment. Modern observers might see inconvenience or hardship, but for them, this was the natural rhythm of life. Yet this delicate balance was fragile. A sudden gust could extinguish lamps. A misstep could scatter embers. A careless motion could start a fire. Life after dark required attention, awareness, and a quiet form of skill invisible to those accustomed to electric illumination. And so the question arises, in such a world of constant vigilance, flickering shadows, and limited light, how did ordinary people cultivate comfort, intimacy, and the rhythms of rest amid the dangers and uncertainties of flame? By the deepest hours of night, households had learned to live within the narrow envelope of firelight. The hearth burned steadily, or small lamps flickered on tables and near beds. The room was a moving pattern of illumination and shadow. Within it, families settled, performing tasks, sharing stories, and simply enduring the darkness beyond. Evenings were long and quiet. Children slept or listened, learning skills by observation. Adults mended clothing, spun thread, sharpened tools, or performed other repetitive tasks that could be accomplished with minimal light. Each action was deliberate. There was no rush. Efficiency was measured against available illumination, not external deadlines. The fire provided more than light. Its warmth made close proximity desirable, encouraging intimacy. Families huddled together, breathing in shared warmth, reinforcing trust, security, and cooperation. Touch became a comfort and a way to communicate presence in the surrounding darkness. Sleeping arrangements reflected this. Children beside parents, siblings sharing blankets, and even domestic animals brought near the hearth for warmth and protection. Smoke, once a nuisance, became part of the rhythm. It signaled life. The patterns of its drift were familiar. You could tell if the fire burned evenly, if wind shifted, or if the chimney vented correctly. Smoke and flame together became an indicator of normalcy. A sudden change, a lack of smoke, or an unusual odor was cause for immediate attention. Survival and reassurance were intertwined. Storytelling continued as a nightly practice. Tales reinforced communal memory, moral lessons, and shared identity. Stories were tailored to the environment. Firelight made them intimate, shadows dramatized them, and the darkness beyond suggested the unknown. Repetition was comforting. Familiar narratives anchored listeners, providing predictability amid the uncertainty of night. Even work was subtly meditative. Tasks like spinning thread, sewing, or churning butter took on a rhythm synchronized with flame. The flicker dictated pace. Mistakes were small, recoverable, and incorporated into learning. Life moved slowly, deliberately, in contrast to the constant speed of modern days. Nighttime dangers persisted, but they were incorporated into the routine. Fires could spread if neglected, thieves could exploit darkness, and accidents were common. Yet the very awareness of these risks shaped behavior, instilling attentiveness without panic. People became highly skilled at operating within limitations, noticing subtle changes in environment, temperature, sound, and shadow. Spiritual life reinforced nighttime rhythms. Evening prayers, the lighting of devotional candles, and contemplation of sacred images created a sense of protection and order. Shadows were not merely obstacles. They symbolized the unknown, inviting reflection. Religious practice and practical vigilance intertwined, shaping both interior life and outward behavior. As dawn approached, the night gradually surrendered. Shadows retreated, smoke drifted upward and dissipated, and the first signs of light signaled readiness for a new day. Sleep ended naturally, often in stages, as the household shifted from the intimate world of flame to the broader realities of daylight. Looking back, fire, smoke, and shadows were more than survival tools. They structured daily life, shaped social interaction, fostered intimacy, and taught patience. Night in pre-modern societies demanded attentiveness, discipline, and ingenuity, but it also offered a rhythm and a quiet form of comfort largely absent in modern, artificially illuminated worlds. The flickering light was not merely functional, it was a medium through which life, family, and community were experienced, in ways that modern brightness has almost entirely erased. And as the story of night continues, one wonders, how did those who lived even more intimately with darkness, monks, travelers, and rural families, balance danger, reflection, and human connection when there was no fire, no lamp, and no walls to contain the night? Story 5. Shared beds and shared breaths, how families slept together. Step into a medieval home at night. The hearth has been banked, the evening meal finished, and the household has gathered for warmth and security. The room is small, sometimes little more than a single chamber, and the beds, if they exist at all, are few. Space is limited, privacy a luxury unknown. In these conditions, families slept together, and the arrangement shaped not only rest, but intimacy, comfort, and survival itself. Shared beds were not a matter of choice for most people. They were necessity. Wood and fabric were scarce resources. Beds were expensive, and mattresses stuffed with straw, hay, wool, or feathers were labor-intensive to prepare. To sleep in a separate bed or room was a privilege reserved for the wealthy. For peasants and townsfolk alike, the body heat of family members was essential to surviving cold nights. Imagine lying beside your siblings, or your children, or your spouse, as the firelight flickers on the walls. Every body provides warmth, creating a thermal network that compensates for the thin walls and drafty windows. A single blanket may cover several people. Clothing is worn through the night to retain heat. Movement is careful to avoid disturbing the collective comfort. Sleeping together also carried emotional weight. Touch provided reassurance in the face of darkness, uncertainty, and danger. The presence of others was a constant reminder that you were not alone. This intimacy reinforced bonds and allowed families to manage the anxiety that naturally arose during long, cold nights. Fear of thieves, animals, or illness was mitigated by collective vigilance, even while asleep. Beds themselves were multi-purpose. By day, they might serve as seats, storage platforms, or work surfaces. By night, they became centers of life and survival. In some households, animals were brought into the sleeping area for warmth, not indulgence. Cats, dogs, and even small livestock might share the room, contributing heat and alertness. Their presence was practical, but also a subtle form of companionship in the dark. Sleep patterns were not uniform. Unlike the modern assumption of continuous rest, medieval people practiced segmented sleep. You would sleep for several hours, wake in the middle of the night, and then return to rest until dawn. During this waking period, the household might perform quiet tasks, checking fires, tending animals, or speaking softly to one another. This interval was considered natural, not insomnia. Shared beds made this rhythm easier to maintain. Someone always heard or watched, even unconsciously, allowing individual members to rest with a sense of security. In larger households, space was managed carefully. Younger children might sleep with parents. Older children might share with siblings. Servants or extended family sometimes slept nearby. Sleeping arrangements were negotiated socially, balancing warmth, hierarchy, and comfort. The physical closeness reinforced social structure. Authority, care, and responsibility were enacted not only during the day but also in the intimate night. The night was also a time of storytelling, teaching, and reflection. Sitting or lying close together, families told tales of ancestors, of local history, of moral lessons, and of survival. These narratives were a shared practice, reinforcing identity, passing down knowledge, and providing reassurance that the world, though dangerous, was navigable. Illness or injury was treated within this same framework. If a child or adult became sick during the night, the proximity of others allowed immediate care. Shared beds were practical. Someone could hold a fevered body, offer warmth, or monitor breathing without leaving the cold or dark. In this way, night intimacy was a strategy for survival as much as comfort. Privacy, as we understand it today, was rare. There were no separate bedrooms for each individual. Nakedness, modesty, and personal boundaries were adapted to the circumstances. Social norms emphasized cooperation, patience, and respect within the close quarters of shared sleeping arrangements. You learned early that proximity required negotiation, awareness, and trust. The practice of sleeping together also shaped emotional resilience. The body learned patterns of warmth, pressure, and rhythm. Sleep cycles were synchronized to some degree across the household, allowing quieter members to rest while others were awake. Emotional bonds were reinforced through repeated nighttime proximity. Anxiety, grief, or fear could be mitigated simply by presence. Yet shared beds were not without tension. Crowding could provoke discomfort, disputes, and awkwardness. But these were accepted as part of life, minor inconveniences compared to the risks of cold, darkness, or isolation. The benefits, warmth, security, and emotional closeness far outweighed the downsides. By the first light of dawn, everyone stirred together, stretching and moving in the confined space. Bodies warmed by human heat, fire, and layered clothing, prepared for the day ahead. Night had been survived collectively, not individually. Its lessons, patience, cooperation, attentiveness, and intimacy carried forward into waking life. And as you consider this, a question emerges. In households where space was limited, nights were long, and dangers abundant. How did individuals cultivate personal rest and quiet reflection without the separations modern life takes for granted? Once the household settled into the rhythm of shared sleep, the night took on its own structure. These hours were not merely a pause from labor. They were a continuation of life in a slower, more intimate form. Families developed subtle routines and strategies to manage warmth, attention, and alertness within the confined space of the sleeping area. The hearth remained central, even in bedrooms. Fires were carefully banked to provide a steady glow without overwhelming smoke. Flames were low, producing enough light to see hands and faces but not enough to disturb sleep. The fire's heat radiated outward, reducing the need for multiple blankets and allowing those further from the hearth to remain warm. Firelight also reinforced a sense of safety. Its gentle flicker reminded families that life continued, that the household remained intact, and that danger had not breached the walls. Adults often monitored the night in quiet shifts. One parent might wake intermittently to tend the fire or check on children. In larger households, this rotation could include older siblings or trusted servants. This shared vigilance ensured that the household remained safe and warm, while allowing others to maintain longer periods of uninterrupted sleep. These routines were practiced silently and almost imperceptibly, integrated into the fabric of the night. Children learned to adapt to this system intuitively. They slept close to adults for warmth, often waking briefly during the night and then returning to sleep without fuss. Proximity became a teacher. Touch, breathing patterns, and subtle movements communicated reassurance, reducing anxiety and helping even the youngest family members develop a sense of security. Even mundane tasks were integrated into the nightly rhythm. The quiet spinning of thread, mending of garments, or sharpening of tools could be done by one or two people near the fire, while others slept. The glow illuminated only a small space, so activity remained localized and unobtrusive. Night was a time of measured motion, where noise, light, and heat were carefully balanced to maintain collective comfort. Privacy, though limited, was not entirely absent. Families developed unspoken agreements about positioning, movement, and behavior during sleep. Adults instinctively adjusted to allow children more space. Siblings learned to avoid disturbing one another. Even small gestures, like turning slightly or keeping voices low, created microboundaries within a shared space. These habits shaped cooperation and awareness, teaching self-control and empathy in ways modern households rarely require. The natural pattern of segmented sleep was accommodated through these arrangements. Many household members woke for an hour or so during the night. This time was used for quiet reflection, prayer, or small tasks. Shared beds allowed these brief periods of wakefulness without compromising the rest of others. Someone would often remain alert enough to notice unusual sounds, an animal stirring, a gust of wind, or the creak of a structural beam, while the rest of the household continued sleeping. Animals remained integral participants. Dogs, cats, and sometimes small livestock shared the sleeping area, providing both warmth and early warning. Their movements were subtle but noticed, part of the household's intricate sensory system. Even the smallest sound carried meaning. Families became adept at reading cues, distinguishing normal movements from potential threats, blending instinct with experience. Nighttime storytelling and conversation continued, but in moderated form. Soft voices and familiar tales reinforced communal identity and emotional stability. Repetition was comforting. Oral transmission of skills, family history, and moral lessons helped children develop understanding while simultaneously preparing them to navigate the same nighttime environment when they became adults. Health and hygiene were considered within these constraints. Adults might adjust positions to avoid damp or drafts, add blankets, or rearrange sleeping companions as temperatures shifted through the night. Such adjustments were minor but essential for comfort and endurance, particularly in winter months. In this context, night became a space of observation, adaptation, and subtle management. Every person in the household contributed to the success of the night, whether through vigilance, movement, or stillness. Sleep was not a purely individual experience, it was a collective achievement. Yet challenges remained. Crowding could provoke restlessness or disputes. Illness could spread more easily when families slept together. Fires could fail. Winter brought extreme cold. Despite these risks, the benefits: warmth, protection, social bonding, and emotional reassurance were indispensable. The shared bed, far from being a simple necessity, became a central mechanism through which survival and human connection were maintained. This raises a deeper question. Within such constant proximity, how did individuals cultivate a sense of personal reflection, dreams, and emotional space? And how did these shared nights shape the inner life of people living under constraints that modern solitude has almost entirely eliminated? By the final hours of the night, households had settled into a rhythm that balanced warmth, vigilance, and shared presence. The fire, carefully banked hours earlier, still glowed faintly, providing light and comfort for those who remained awake or had briefly risen during the night. Sleep in these households was not a solitary state but a networked experience, a web of breathing, movement, and attentiveness that extended across every body in the room. Shared beds were the nexus of survival. Physical proximity provided warmth essential for enduring long, cold nights, particularly in winter. Blankets and clothing were shared, layered strategically, and adjusted through the night to maintain comfort. Each person's position was shaped by necessity: parents near infants, older siblings closer to younger ones, and all bodies arranged to maximize heat retention and minimize disturbance. Even small shifts, a nudge, a turn, a sigh, were noticed and responded to by those nearby, creating a subtle, almost imperceptible choreography. Yet shared sleeping was more than practicality. It reinforced emotional bonds. The presence of others mitigated fear. The darkness outside the walls, the potential dangers of fire, illness, or intruders, all became more manageable when faced together. In the quiet night, trust was continuously enacted. Someone would respond to a cough or movement. A restless child was comforted without waking everyone, and small adjustments preserved the overall stability of the group. This intimacy extended beyond immediate survival. Stories told before sleep, songs murmured quietly, and shared observation of the fire reinforced family identity and memory. Children internalized skills, morals, and social norms in a context that was simultaneously practical and emotionally resonant. The night became both a teacher and a test of endurance, shaping habits, attentiveness, and resilience. Even in discomfort, people learned to adapt. Crowding, limited bedding, drafts, and fluctuating temperatures required negotiation. Individuals adjusted without complaint, guided by social understanding, patience, and the recognition that the collective well-being depended on cooperation. The demands of the night fostered skills in empathy, self-control, and observation, qualities often overlooked in modern discussions of family life. The waking periods in segmented sleep were also significant. These hours, whether used for tending fires, quiet work, or prayer, allowed reflection, planning, and preparation for the coming day. In a shared bed, even wakefulness was social and structured. Someone remained alert to monitor danger, while others rested, knowing they could rely on those awake. This balance of vigilance and rest was a microcosm of the household's larger strategy for survival. Animals, too, played roles in comfort and security. Cats kept rodents at bay. Dogs alerted to unusual sounds. Even small livestock contributed warmth and rhythm. Their presence, integrated into the sleeping arrangement, enhanced safety and emotional reassurance. Life in darkness, in this way, became a communal endeavor encompassing both humans and animals. By dawn, the household emerged from the night as a unified organism. Bodies stretched, firelight faded, and the first sounds of the day, birds, work, or distant activity, signaled transition. Night had been survived collectively. Skills, habits, and bonds forged in the shared darkness carried into daytime life, influencing work, cooperation, and social interactions. Looking back, these shared sleeping practices reveal a striking human capacity: the ability to endure discomfort, manage vulnerability, and derive emotional comfort from intimacy and interdependence. Modern notions of privacy, individual rest, and personal space obscure the subtle strategies through which pre-modern families cultivated resilience, safety, and emotional stability. In sleeping together, they learned lessons about attention, patience, and the quiet power of presence that illuminated both the night and the day that followed. And as you consider these intimate rhythms, one question remains: what did it feel like to dream within such proximity, where every breath, movement, and murmur became part of a shared nocturnal life? How did the boundaries of self, rest, and reflection adapt to these ever-present neighbors of warmth and vigilance? Story 6. The Monastic Night Prayer, Silence, and Vigil. Imagine stepping into a medieval monastery as night falls. Outside, the world is dim, filled with the sounds of distant animals, the whisper of wind through trees, and the occasional human voice retreating into homes. Inside the cloister walls, the night is structured, purposeful, and exacting. It is not the aimless darkness of a village street, nor the quiet unpredictability of a family bedchamber. Here, every hour, every movement, every breath is accounted for in the discipline of the monastic night. Monks followed a strict schedule dictated by the canonical hours, dividing the day and night into intervals of prayer, labor, and rest. By the time evening fell, the majority of secular activity had ceased. Work was done. Meals were finished. The monks withdrew to the quiet spaces of the cloister, cells, and oratory. Night was not idle, it was devoted to vigilance of a spiritual kind. The first major event of the evening was Vespers. This prayer, conducted in the dim light of candles or torches, marked the transition from the labor of the day to the attentiveness of the night. You would hear the monks moving silently along stone corridors, sandals or bare feet softly brushing against worn floors. There was a rhythm to these movements, each step measured, each voice harmonized, each gesture deliberate. Even the sound of breathing seemed mindful, as though the body itself contributed to the discipline of prayer. Lighting was minimal but purposeful. Large braziers illuminated the main hall, casting long shadows that deepened the sense of space and silence. Candles flickered near altars and sacred images. Every flame was treated as both a guide and a symbol, light against spiritual darkness, focus for meditation, and tool to allow reading or chanting. The monks were acutely aware of the fragility of this illumination. Extinguishing a candle prematurely was not merely a practical problem, it disrupted the cadence of the night, the shared focus of the community, and the rhythm of contemplation. Silence dominated the monastic night, not a mere absence of sound, but a disciplined, intentional quiet. Conversations were limited to necessity, whispered or communicated through gestures. Footsteps were restrained. Doors were closed gently. Even the creaking of beams was moderated where possible. This silence was a tool, sharpening the senses and heightening awareness of inner life. In the absence of external noise, the mind turned inward, attending to prayer, reflection, and the subtle nuances of consciousness. The schedule of night was long. After Vespers came Compline, the final prayer of the day, often conducted with bowed heads and hushed voices. Then the monks withdrew to their cells for a period of rest, interrupted by nocturnal vigils. In some orders, such as the Benedictines, the night was punctuated by matins or nocturnes, when the monks arose to chant psalms or prayers, sometimes deep in the darkness before dawn. Sleep was thus fragmented and carefully managed, interwoven with periods of attention and devotion. Physical comfort was minimal. Cells were small and sparsely furnished. A thin mattress, simple blanket, and wooden bench sufficed. Cold stone floors and drafty walls were commonplace. Warmth came from layering clothing, from proximity to others in communal areas, or from brief visits to heated spaces. The discomfort was not accidental, it was intended to cultivate discipline, detachment, and awareness of the body's needs in contrast to the soul's work. The rhythm of the monastic night created a unique relationship with darkness. The absence of light was never empty. Every shadow, flicker, and sound became part of a conscious practice. Steps were measured to avoid disturbing others. The mind learned to move along with the body, attentive, patient, and disciplined. Even moments of sleep were framed by awareness. A monk waking briefly would rise quietly, pray, and then return to rest, maintaining harmony with the surrounding silence. Yet even within this rigor, the night offered comfort. The repetition of prayers, the steady presence of fellow monks, and the slow unfolding of hours provided structure and stability. Darkness became predictable, meaningful, and deeply inhabited. The rhythm of the monastic night was both protective and formative, shaping the mind, body, and spirit in ways impossible in unstructured life. But how did monks endure such long nights without succumbing to fatigue, despair, or distraction? What strategies, spiritual, mental, and physical, allowed them to maintain wakefulness, attention, and devotion through hours of darkness, solitude, and silence? Once the first prayers of the evening concluded, the monastic night settled into its long, measured rhythm. Darkness surrounded the monastery, yet within its walls, life moved according to precise rules. Sleep was allowed, but it was carefully regulated. Monks learned to balance rest with periods of vigilance, ensuring that both body and soul remained attentive through the long hours. One strategy was segmented sleep. similar to practices observed among ordinary people in villages, but structured around devotion rather than mere survival. A monk would sleep for a few hours after compline, then awaken for nocturnal prayers such as matins. These wakeful periods were not arbitrary. They were prescribed by the order, ensuring spiritual discipline while allowing the body to recover in short intervals. By training the body to sleep in fragments, monks could sustain prolonged nights without succumbing to fatigue. Physical position and comfort were also carefully considered. Cells were sparsely furnished with simple mattresses or pallets, but monks often slept sitting upright or with minimal bedding to remain alert. Layers of clothing were worn to maintain warmth in stone chambers. Cold, discomfort, and minimal cushioning were intentional. They discouraged indulgence in sleep and fostered mental focus. Fatigue was managed through posture, controlled breathing, and gradual acclimation to austerity. Mental strategies were equally crucial. Prayer itself functioned as both vigilance and meditation. Chanting psalms, reciting liturgical texts, and reflecting on sacred images created a framework that occupied attention while warding off drowsiness. The mind was engaged, but the engagement was contemplative rather than distracting. Even the repetition of familiar words and phrases sharpened focus, creating a rhythm that synchronized body, mind, and the passing of time. Silence amplified awareness. In the absence of external noise, subtle cues, creaking floors, distant footsteps, the movement of air were noticed. Monks learned to interpret these signs, using them to remain present and attentive. Silence also fostered an internal focus. Thoughts were observed, refined, and aligned with spiritual discipline. This mental vigilance reinforced the nocturnal routine, creating a form of cognitive endurance. The monastic night was also communal. While each monk occupied a cell, the collective schedule dictated movement, prayer, and rest. Bells rang at precise hours, signaling transitions from one period of attention to another. The sound of a single bell resonated through the dark halls, reminding every member of their shared purpose. This external structure allowed individuals to remain aligned with the community, reducing disorientation and reinforcing discipline. Even meals and sustenance were adapted for nighttime endurance. Small portions were consumed strategically to maintain energy without inducing drowsiness. Warm drinks, simple bread, or pottage provided nourishment while avoiding the heaviness that could interfere with wakefulness. Timing and moderation were essential. Indulgence was discouraged, both for spiritual reasons and practical alertness. Monks also cultivated mindful observation. The dark, silent corridors became spaces of perception. Every flickering candle, every shadow cast by torchlight, every breath of air was attended to consciously. Observing the environment reinforced attention and patience. The night was both external and internal, requiring navigation of physical spaces and the subtler terrain of thought and emotion. Periods of solitary reflection allowed monks to confront discomfort, fear, or distraction. Darkness encouraged introspection. In these moments, monks examined conscience, contemplated scripture, or simply observed their own breathing and heartbeat. Such practices strengthened mental endurance and cultivated emotional resilience, enabling prolonged engagement with the night. Yet, even with careful routines, fatigue was inevitable. Monks learned to respond with gentle movement, short prayers, or shifts in posture. Awareness of bodily limits was crucial. Too much insistence on wakefulness could lead to collapse. Too much surrender to sleep risked neglecting spiritual duties. Balance was constantly negotiated, moment by moment. This discipline produced more than vigilance, it created a profound intimacy with the night itself. Monks came to inhabit darkness, to move within it confidently, and to experience the passage of hours with deliberate awareness. Night was no longer merely absence of light. It became a medium for spiritual practice, self-mastery, and communal cohesion. But the question lingers. What inner transformations occurred when nights were repeatedly lived in this delicate balance of wakefulness, prayer, and minimal comfort? How did long, silent hours of attentiveness shape perception, morality, and the very experience of time for those devoted to the monastic night. As the night deepened, the monastery became a landscape of measured motion, whispered breath, and candlelight shadows. Each monk followed the same cycles of wakefulness, prayer, and brief rest, yet within this uniformity, individual experience varied. Nights were long, silent, and austere, yet they were also spaces of transformation where physical endurance, mental focus, and spiritual insight converged. By the final third of the night, when most of the world outside slept, the monastery was alive in a subtle, disciplined way. Monks rose quietly for matins or nocturnes, moving along dimly lit corridors with careful attention to avoid disturbing others. The flicker of candlelight illuminated worn faces, knobby hands, and carefully folded garments. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and attuned to the rhythms of the community. Sleep was deeply fragmented, yet this fragmentation shaped perception rather than weakening it. Moments of wakefulness allowed reflection, meditation, and the performance of duties with heightened clarity. Even the briefest period of alertness could encompass observation of the natural world, the changing shadows of flame, the cold touch of stone floors, the distant sounds of wind and animal life outside the walls. Night, in this way, became an expansive realm, not of emptiness, but of intimate awareness. Physical austerity played a crucial role. Cold, hard sleeping surfaces, minimal bedding, and sparse clothing trained the body to endure discomfort while maintaining alertness. Fatigue was managed with posture, prayer, and micro-movements, allowing monks to sustain prolonged vigilance. Pain and discomfort, rather than being purely obstacles, became tools for cultivating attention, patience, and resilience. The mental and spiritual disciplines of the night reinforced each other. Prayer, repeated chants, and silent reflection provided a rhythm that steadied the mind, creating a bridge between body and spirit. Thoughts were organized, refined, and focused. The darkness became a mirror, reflecting inner states and offering opportunities for self-awareness that daylight rarely permitted. Communal cohesion remained essential. Even in solitude, every monk was part of a living system. Bells marked transitions, chants echoed across halls, and the knowledge that others were awake, alert, and observing lent security and order. Discipline was reinforced collectively, ensuring that individual deviations, moments of sleepiness, distraction, or error were contained within the rhythm of the community. Yet nights were not merely endured, they were inhabited. Monks experienced a heightened sensitivity to the world around them. The smallest flicker of flame, the faintest movement in a shadow, or the subtle shift in air temperature was meaningful. Their senses became attuned to nuance, their perception sharpened by repetition, focus, and necessity. In darkness, ordinary life expanded into a profound awareness of environment, self, and others. At dawn, the monastery exhaled collectively. Candles burned low, floors were quiet, and the cold stones of the cloister had absorbed hours of movement, breath, and reflection. Sleep returned more fully, but its quality was different from modern, uninterrupted rest. It was restorative yet layered, interwoven with periods of wakefulness, vigilance, and reflection. The night's structure, discipline, and attentiveness carried forward into daily life, shaping work, thought, and interpersonal relationships. Looking back, the monastic night reveals a remarkable capacity of humans to adapt to darkness not as absence, but as medium. It demanded patience, endurance, and attentiveness. It cultivated mindfulness, resilience, and a sense of connectedness to both community and inner life. The lessons learned within these walls: attention to subtle cues, endurance through discomfort, and the cultivation of inner stillness resonate far beyond monastic confines, illuminating human adaptability in the face of challenge. And one final reflection remains. In a world without artificial light, where darkness was a constant presence, how might ordinary lives have been transformed if each night were approached with such deliberate attentiveness, patience, and integration of mind, body, and community? Story 7. The Lantern Makers Crafting Light in a Dark World. Imagine walking through a medieval town just as dusk settles. Shadows stretch across uneven cobblestones, and most households are retreating into dimly lit rooms. In the midst of this darkness, a small workshop glows faintly with the warm light of a fire. Inside, a lantern maker is at work, shaping materials to hold and direct light, a craft both practical and essential in a world without electricity. Lanterns were far more than decorative objects. They were survival tools, guiding travelers along streets, illuminating homes, and signaling the presence of activity. The construction of a single lantern required skill, patience, and a precise understanding of how fire, smoke, and materials interacted. Even a slight misalignment could produce too little light or pose a dangerous fire risk. Materials varied widely depending on wealth, location, and available resources. Metal frames were common in wealthier towns, often made of iron or copper, holding thin sheets of horn or mica to diffuse light. Simpler lanterns used wood, paper, or oiled cloth. Each material had strengths and weaknesses. Horn diffused flame but yellowed over time. Glass was rare and fragile. Paper was cheap but highly flammable. The lantern maker had to balance brightness, durability, and safety with careful craftsmanship. Inside the workshop, the process was meticulous. The frame was shaped first, ensuring stability. Hinges, clasps, and handles were fitted for ease of use. The translucent panels were carefully measured and attached, often overlapping to prevent sparks from escaping. Finally, a candle or oil lamp would be inserted. Each step was executed with concentration, awareness that one careless move could ruin the lantern or endanger its eventual users. The role of the lantern maker was not merely technical. It required intimate knowledge of fire behavior. Smoke patterns, fuel types, and wick placement determined efficiency and safety. A poorly designed lantern could extinguish easily, flare dangerously, or provide inadequate illumination. Mastery of the craft demanded observation, experimentation, and experience lessons learned through trial, error, and often minor burns. Lanterns shaped human behavior. Streets became navigable after dark, markets extended their hours, and travelers could journey with greater security. Fires contained within lanterns reduced the risk of igniting buildings while allowing illumination in otherwise pitch-black areas. In monasteries, guild halls, and private homes, lanterns focused attention, enabling work, study, or prayer that would otherwise be impossible. Yet the lantern was also a symbol of status. Wealthier citizens could afford finely crafted metal and glass lanterns, providing brighter, steadier, and longer-lasting light. Poorer households relied on simpler, more fragile versions. Even the type of fuel used beeswax, olive oil, tallow signaled economic and social differences. Light, in this sense, was not purely functional. It carried social meaning. The demand for lanterns was constant. Towns, monasteries, and travelers all required them. Repairs were frequent. Wind could shatter glass, flames could warp frames, and smoke could blacken translucent panels. Lantern makers maintained a continuous cycle of crafting, repairing, and selling their wares. In some towns, this trade was regulated by guilds, who ensured quality, set standards, and trained apprentices. Craftsmanship was guarded knowledge, passed from master to apprentice through hours of patient observation and repetition. Lanterns also influenced patterns of night activity. People timed their errands, walks, and work according to available illumination. Social gatherings, prayers, and even crimes were shaped by the reach and reliability of artificial light. Streets that were once dangerous became accessible. Markets could stay open later. Families could perform domestic tasks beyond sunset. The humble lantern transformed the experience of darkness, extending human capability while retaining the ever-present threat of fire. Even the act of carrying a lantern required attentiveness. Hold it too close, and the flame could flare. Too far, and shadows deepened, obscuring danger. The lantern holder became a participant in a delicate dance with fire and shadow, learning through trial and error to navigate safely while illuminating the surroundings. In this way, the lantern maker's work extended far beyond the workshop. It shaped daily life, commerce, safety, and perception. Every flicker of flame, every carefully crafted panel, contributed to human adaptation to darkness. Lanterns were not merely tools, they were mediators between humans and the night, making the invisible visible, the dangerous navigable, and the long hours of darkness survivable. And yet, one question persists. Despite all care in crafting and handling, what risks and failures haunted those who depended on lanterns nightly? How did ordinary people navigate the delicate balance between illumination, safety, and vulnerability in a world where one spark could be both lifeline and hazard? The medieval night was a realm of uncertainty, and the lantern maker's craft provided both security and freedom. Yet lanterns were far from perfect. Even the most carefully constructed lantern flickered unpredictably, cast uneven shadows, or sputtered due to poor fuel. Life after dark remained precarious, and people quickly learned how to adapt to the limitations of artificial light. In households, lanterns were positioned strategically. They were rarely carried aimlessly. A single flame could illuminate a work surface, a doorway, or a stairwell. Families learned to move around them carefully, extending their reach with reflective surfaces, mirrors, or lightly colored walls. Even the angle of placement mattered. Too high and shadows obscured details. Too low, and the flame risked contact with flammable materials. Every household adapted to its own environment, finding subtle solutions to the capricious behavior of fire. Street lanterns, though less common, were particularly valued. Traders, night watchmen, and late travelers relied on them to navigate unfamiliar terrain. But even then, danger lurked. Wind could extinguish a flame, smoke could obscure vision, and shadows cast by buildings or uneven roads could hide hazards. Traveling at night required more than lanterns, it demanded experience, patience, and a keen eye. People developed routines, avoiding certain alleys, walking slowly, and timing their movement to periods of higher visibility. Lanterns were aids, not guarantees. The craft of lantern making also involved innovation. Masters experimented with shapes, materials, and fuel. Horn, mica, and thin sheets of glass were arranged to diffuse light more evenly. Wicks were trimmed to control flame height. Metalwork was refined to prevent warping or heat transfer. Lanterns evolved slowly over generations, each small improvement increasing reliability, reducing risk, and enhancing the quality of life after dark. Apprentices learned these subtleties through observation, repetition, and careful guidance, absorbing not just technique, but an understanding of the delicate interplay between fire, air, and shadow. The social impact of lanterns was profound. Markets could remain open later, allowing commerce to continue beyond daylight. Religious rituals, study, and domestic work were extended into the night. Communities became more interconnected as individuals moved with greater confidence in otherwise pitch-black streets. Lanterns reshaped the boundaries of safety and activity, creating pockets of human presence within the encompassing darkness. Yet danger never disappeared. Fires remained a constant threat. A dropped lantern could ignite a building. A carelessly trimmed wick could flare unexpectedly. Smoke inhalation was a concern in confined spaces, and the flickering flame could mislead the eye, creating illusions that prompted accidents. People learned to respect the flame, to move deliberately, and to adjust constantly to its behavior. The lamp was both tool and teacher, providing illumination while demanding attentiveness. In monasteries, lanterns played a particularly refined role. They guided monks through stone corridors and dimly lit oratories, allowing them to read, chant, or meditate. Yet the principles were the same. Every candle or lamp was a carefully managed system. Too much flame created heat, smoke, or distraction. Too little left work incomplete or dangerous. The monks' nighttime discipline extended to their use of light, blending technical awareness with spiritual focus. Even carrying a lantern required skill. One had to anticipate drafts, obstacles, and the movement of others. The flicker of the flame revealed subtle contours of space, but misjudging its placement could plunge the carrier into shadow or, worse, ignite nearby materials. Each person became an active participant in a delicate balance between illumination and risk, learning patterns of light as intuitively as we now read streetlights and sidewalks. Lanterns were thus central to human adaptation. They were not merely physical objects but mediators between life and darkness. The craft of making them, maintaining them, and using them shaped behavior, perception, and social organization. Night became navigable, yet remained alive with uncertainty, teaching attentiveness, patience, and respect for forces beyond human control. But one question lingers. In a world where the smallest lapse could lead to disaster, how did ordinary people negotiate the tension between curiosity, movement, and caution, when every flicker of flame could both illuminate and deceive? How did the interplay of light, shadow, and human perception shape the way they experienced the long hours of darkness? By the final hours of night, lanterns had fulfilled their role as both guide and guardian. Their small, flickering flames illuminated tables where families worked, corridors where monks tread softly, and streets where travelers moved cautiously. Yet their presence was never passive. Each lantern demanded awareness, attention, and respect. Its flame was alive, shifting unpredictably with drafts, temperature changes, and fuel quality. Survival, movement, and comfort depended on understanding this dynamic. In households, lanterns shaped routine and behavior. Evening work, meals, and social interaction were centered around the radius of illumination. The glow dictated where one could sit, what one could handle safely, and when tasks were completed. Tasks beyond the light's reach were postponed until daylight, creating a natural rhythm aligned with the capabilities of fire. This structure instilled patience and deliberate planning, a lesson largely absent in modern life, where artificial light allows uninterrupted activity regardless of nightfall. Travelers relied on portable lanterns to traverse uneven, unlit roads. Every step was measured. Cobblestones, potholes, and unexpected obstacles demanded constant attention. Flickering light created illusions, sometimes revealing dangers too late or suggesting threats that did not exist. Navigating these spaces required both skill and caution, teaching users to integrate visual cues, sound, and experience. Each journey was a negotiation with darkness, and lanterns were the mediator. Lanterns also reinforced communal life. In markets, workshops, and religious spaces, shared illumination enabled coordination. One flickering flame could illuminate a craftsman's table or a street corner, extending the hours of work, commerce, and interaction. The spread of lanterns, even sparse, created interconnected islands of human activity within the vast blackness of night. People learned to move between these islands, guided by both light and knowledge of the landscape. Yet with opportunity came risk. Fires could spread, lamps could topple, and smoke could obscure vision. These dangers demanded vigilance. Households placed lanterns carefully, monitored them throughout the night, and repaired or replaced them regularly. Traveling merchants often carried spare lamps or oil, knowing that illumination was inseparable from safety. The slightest lapse could have cascading consequences, making lanterns not only tools, but instruments of responsibility and discipline. The craft of lantern making, therefore, was deeply consequential. It was not an artistic indulgence or a minor trade. It was central to survival, commerce, social interaction, and human adaptation to darkness. Master lantern makers trained apprentices carefully, passing down not only the skills to construct and maintain lanterns, but also the knowledge of how humans and light interact in an unpredictable environment. Knowledge of flame behavior, material properties, and human perception was transmitted alongside technical skill. Even in monasteries, lanterns were carefully integrated into ritual and study. Braziers, torches, and small lamps guided monks through the night, enabling prayer, reading, and reflection. The careful balance of light and shadow reinforced attentiveness and humility. Too much light would disrupt focus. Too little would hinder comprehension. Mastery of the craft became a quiet form of spiritual discipline, reinforcing patience, foresight, and respect for the natural rhythm of darkness. Ultimately, lanterns were more than objects, they were lifelines. They connected humans to each other, to their work, and to the world beyond immediate reach. They created a fragile but essential bridge between night and action, uncertainty and clarity, fear and reassurance. In their glow, people learned caution, patience, adaptation, and the subtle art of moving through a world that was, by its very nature, dark and unpredictable. And so we are left with a reflection. Even the simplest objects, the flicker of a flame behind horn or glass, can shape the contours of human experience. In a world of darkness, a single lantern could mean the difference between safety and danger, work and delay, isolation and connection. How differently might we perceive night and risk if we had to negotiate it with such careful attention to each flame, each shadow, and each step, every evening of our lives. Story 8. Night Watchmen and Town Guards, Protectors of Darkness. As night falls over a medieval town, darkness does not simply wait, it envelops streets, alleyways, and squares, swallowing detail and distorting perception. In these hours, when most residents have retreated indoors and hearths cast only small pools of light, the responsibility for safety falls to a select few: the night watchmen and town guards. These men, or occasionally women, though rarely, stood as the human interface between order and chaos, between visible spaces and the hidden dangers of the dark. Unlike modern police, night watchmen had limited tools. A lantern, a staff, a whistle or horn, and perhaps a small weapon were their standard equipment. Their work relied less on technology than on vigilance, intuition, and intimate knowledge of the town's geography. They memorized the layout of streets, the weaknesses of gates, and the habits of neighbors, criminals, and wildlife. Every stone and corner became familiar through repetition and observation. Their duties were arduous. From sunset until the early hours of morning, they patrolled streets and alleys, listening for unusual sounds and observing subtle movements in the shadows. Silence was their companion. The creak of a shutter, the rustle of clothing, or the faint murmur of a dog could indicate a potential threat. In complete darkness, sound and memory guided them more than sight. Their eyes were trained to detect motion rather than detail, shadows rather than objects. Lanterns were both blessing and limitation. A flame offered immediate illumination, allowing identification of obstacles or strangers, but it also betrayed the guard's position. Firelight cast shadows that could mislead the eye, exaggerated movements, and created illusions. A single flicker could hide a figure just beyond reach. The watchman had to learn to balance the need for light with the necessity of stealth, often relying on peripheral perception rather than direct illumination. Many towns relied on a system of rotation. Watchmen patrolled in pairs or small groups, alternating routes and positions. Communication was simple yet effective. Whistles, rattles, or horns signaled danger, coordinated attention, or warned neighbors. The patrol was continuous, ensuring that no section of town remained entirely unmonitored. Even in the quietest moments, the sense of vigilance was palpable. Citizens slept more soundly knowing that these guardians were present, while watchmen themselves endured a constant tension between alertness and fatigue. Night guards often had knowledge of past incidents. Fires, thefts, and altercations provided lessons for future patrols. They learned the hours when trouble was most likely to occur, the areas most vulnerable, and the behaviors that indicated danger. In this way, their role was both preventative and reactive. They sought to prevent incidents through presence, but were prepared to respond swiftly when problems arose. The conditions of their work were harsh. Exposure to cold, rain, snow, and wind was constant. Streets were uneven, often muddy or littered with debris. Guards developed physical resilience and endurance, moving for hours without rest. Their senses adapted. Hearing sharpened to subtle shifts in the environment, touch became a guide when visual cues were insufficient, and even the smell of smoke, animals, or decaying matter carried warning. Night was not merely a practical challenge, it was a psychological one. The darkness could be disorienting. Shadows exaggerated fears, and the mind could easily misinterpret ordinary sounds. Watchmen learned to manage anxiety and maintain focus, cultivating a form of mental toughness essential to their survival. Each patrol was a training in observation, discernment, and controlled reaction. The social role of the night watch extended beyond safety. They enforced curfews, ensured that gates were closed, and regulated the movement of people and animals. In doing so, they reinforced civic order, maintained property security, and shaped the rhythms of urban life. Their presence structured the night itself, creating invisible boundaries and expectations that influenced behavior far beyond immediate intervention. Yet despite all preparation, risk was ever present. An inattentive moment could allow theft, arson, or attack. Fatigue, misjudgment, or misperception could have consequences for both the guard and the townspeople. Their work demanded constant awareness, balance, and adaptability, qualities that ordinary citizens rarely had to practice in such intensity. This raises a compelling question. In a world of near-complete darkness, without streetlights or modern surveillance, how did these night guardians maintain vigilance and judgment across long hours? And what methods or habits allowed them to survive the psychological strain of patrolling human and animal dangers while largely alone? As the town settled under the blanket of darkness, the night watchmen moved along familiar streets and alleys, becoming attuned to the invisible rhythms of the town. Each patrol was a delicate balance: attention to the environment, awareness of human behavior, and careful management of one's own fatigue. Success depended on training, habit, and intimate knowledge of both the town and its residents. One of the key strategies for effective patrol was predictive awareness. Guards memorized the locations of vulnerabilities: poorly secured doors, low-hanging beams, or narrow alleys that obscured sight. They knew where livestock might escape, where fires were most likely to start, and which corners were favored by thieves or mischief-makers. By anticipating potential threats, watchmen could act before events escalated. They became masters of observation, reading subtle cues: a shadow that lingered too long, a door slightly ajar, or the rustle of movement from an otherwise empty building. Lanterns and torches were carefully employed. Guards learned the art of partial illumination, positioning the flame to cast light on key areas while minimizing their own exposure. The flickering glow also created long, deceptive shadows that could reveal or conceal movement depending on placement. Some guards used reflective surfaces, polished metal, or still water to extend visibility. Every detail mattered. A poorly angled lantern could render a street invisible, while the careful interplay of flame and shadow transformed the night into a navigable space. Communication was another essential tool. Small bells, rattles, or shouted signals ensured coordination across distant parts of the town. Watchmen often worked in pairs, with one moving ahead while the other observed from a distance, a system that allowed coverage of blind spots and shared vigilance without creating noise that might disturb residents. In some towns, citizens contributed by keeping watch from upper windows or courtyard perches, signaling danger with discreet gestures or lantern signals. The night was a shared responsibility, and even limited participation reinforced community safety. Physical endurance was tested relentlessly. Rain, wind, cold, and uneven terrain made every patrol a challenge. Guards learned to adjust their stride, posture, and clothing to maintain warmth, alertness, and mobility. Long nights required packing, alternating between brisk walking to stay awake and slow observation to notice subtle cues. Footwear, cloak, and lantern were carefully managed to maximize both protection and function. Psychological strategies were equally crucial. The mind must remain alert despite monotony, darkness, and occasional false alarms. Guards developed routines to stave off drowsiness, counting steps, reciting prayers or psalms, observing stars when visible, or mentally mapping each street and building in their district. The combination of routine, attention, and engagement prevented lapses in vigilance and honed focus. Despite preparation, Danger was ever present. Thieves, drunks, and wandering animals were constant challenges. Fires could erupt suddenly from unattended hearths or shops. Occasional assaults or conflicts required immediate judgment. Should the guard intervene alone or signal for assistance? Every decision had weight, and every error could threaten both the town and the guard. This constant risk demanded not only technical skill, but emotional control, situational awareness, and rapid problem-solving under uncertainty. Night patrols also shaped perceptions of space. Darkness amplified ordinary features, transforming alleys into mazes and familiar corners into ambiguous zones. Guards learned to interpret subtle signs: a displaced stone, a faint scent, a shifted shadow. The nocturnal town became legible to those trained in attention, while remaining confusing and dangerous to the uninitiated. Mastery of this environment was both skill and survival, blending memory, observation, and intuition. Interestingly, night guards were often among the most knowledgeable about the towns they served. They knew the movements of neighbors, patterns of commerce, and even subtle changes in building or landscape. Their understanding extended beyond mere security. It was social, geographical, and practical. In darkness, their presence structured life itself, making night predictable, manageable, and somewhat safer. Yet fatigue and error could never be fully eliminated. Even the most disciplined watchmen experienced lapses, misjudged shadows, or misunderstood sounds. Some relied on simple routines to reset focus, short pauses to stretch, small lantern adjustments, or silent prayers, maintaining alertness through deliberate physical and mental cues. Survival was not guaranteed, but adaptation, skill, and habit created the best chance for safety. And as we reflect on their labor, one question emerges. How did night watchmen cultivate intuition and judgment to operate in near-complete darkness, balancing vigilance, human unpredictability, and the constant risk of fire or crime, while preserving mental clarity over long, lonely hours? By the final hours before dawn, the night watchmen had completed a complex cycle of observation, caution, and intervention. Their work had not been dramatic in the sense of battles or heroic feats, yet it was vital. Every street illuminated by a lantern, every door secured, every minor disturbance addressed, was a quiet defense against chaos, fire, and crime. The town's safety, and by extension, the survival of countless ordinary lives, depended on this often overlooked vigilance. The night was a continuous negotiation between risk and control. Even as fatigue weighed on limbs and eyelids, the watchmen maintained awareness, relying on refined instincts honed over months and years of patrols. The darkness demanded attention. A faint noise could indicate a thief or a loose animal. A slight shimmer might reveal movement beyond a doorway. By learning to read these signals, guards navigated danger without overreacting, balancing intervention with patience. Lanterns, though modest, were extensions of the watchman's senses. Proper placement extended the radius of safety, but improper handling could mislead, exaggerate shadows, or conceal hazards. In their hands, the lantern was both a tool and a symbol, a lifeline in a world largely defined by darkness. Guards developed intimate familiarity with the interplay of flame, shadow, and perception, understanding that light alone was insufficient without experience and judgment. The communal nature of vigilance was also essential. Patrols were synchronized, signals coordinated, and knowledge shared. A solitary guard could detect a disturbance, but the network ensured coverage, reinforcement, and communication. Even residents contributed to night safety, reinforcing social cohesion and collective responsibility. In this way, the night became an orchestrated system of observation, interaction, and mutual dependence. Beyond physical safety, night guards preserved the town's social order. They enforced curfews, monitored taverns, and ensured that livestock remained contained. Their presence was preventative, shaping behavior as much as responding to threats. Knowledge of watchmen's routes and habits influenced when and where people ventured, creating a subtle but powerful influence on the rhythm of urban life. Yet their labor came with constant uncertainty. Fatigue could dull perception, sudden distractions could compromise judgment, and unpredictable events could escalate quickly. Their success depended on a combination of discipline, physical resilience, acute senses, and psychological fortitude. Each night was both routine and unpredictable, requiring guards to navigate complexity while maintaining composure and vigilance. Over time, these experiences fostered an extraordinary awareness of human and environmental behavior. Watchmen learned to anticipate patterns: how the town's residents moved, how animals reacted, how weather affected streets and fires. They developed a sense of temporal and spatial intuition that modern tools often replace but cannot replicate, an ability to read darkness, shadows, and subtle cues with precision born of experience. The night watch was a quiet kind of heroism. It lacked dramatic confrontation or celebration, yet it shaped the lives of everyone in the town. Every hour of attention, every careful step along cobblestone streets contributed to safety, security, and the continuation of daily life. In a world without streetlights, alarms, or emergency services, the watchmen's skill and diligence were indispensable. Reflecting on their role, one sees the intersection of human adaptability, resilience, and social cooperation. Darkness was not merely absence of light, it was a challenge to be navigated, interpreted, and mastered. The night watchman's vigilance transformed fear into structured safety, uncertainty into predictable rhythms, and vulnerability into managed risk. And one final question remains. In a world where the smallest misstep could endanger life, how did these guardians maintain clarity, courage, and attention through every long, lonely night? And how might their methods inform our understanding of human adaptability in extreme conditions?